Welcome to Breaking Views. History repeats itself. The CBSE has made drastic cuts to its syllabus. It has dropped chapters about the non-aligned movement, the Cold War era, the rise of Islamic empires in Afro-Asian territories, the chronicles of Mughal courts and the Industrial Revolution from the history and political science syllabi of classes 11 and 12. Similarly, in the class 10 syllabus, the topic impact of globalization on agriculture, junked from a chapter on food security, that's been dropped. The translated excerpts from two poems in Urdu by Faiz Ahmad Faiz in Religion, Communalism and Politics in the Communalism Secular State section also excluded. The CBSE, the Central Board of Secondary Education, has also dropped from its course content chapters on democracy and diversity. And when asked about the rationale behind the choice of topics or chapters being dropped, media reports say that officials maintain that these changes are all part of the rationalization of the syllabus and that they are in alignment with the recommendations by the National Council of Educational Research and Training, or the NCERT. Now, this decision also, according to media reports, has been rationalized by the board with a view of reducing the burden on the students of classes 9 to 12. So, they've dropped the chapter on Central Islamic lands. This is in the class 11 history syllabus. It talks about the rise of Islamic empires in the Afro-Asian territories and its implications for the economy and for our society. This is according to the description in last year's syllabus. The chapter focused on arenas of Islam in reference to its emergence, the rise of the caliphate and the empire building. Similarly, in the class 12 history syllabus, they've dropped the chapter titled The Mughal Court, Reconstructing Histories Through Chronicles, which examined the chronicles of the Mughal courts to reconstruct the social, religious and cultural history of the Mughals. And now history is also turning into a political battleground with yet another sign of growing differences between the Bihar Chief Minister Nitish Kumar's Janata Dal United and senior partner, the BJP. Differences have now cropped up over these changes to the curriculum, and the Bihar Education Minister, considered to be close to party boss, the Chief Minister, has today expressed reservations about this move. He says it is impractical and an illogical idea. Of course, the senior Congress leader Rahul Gandhi over the weekend had called the National Level Board of Education the Central Board of Suppressing Education in a scathing tweet. All right, so syllabus rationalization process. To study or not to study? What to chuck and what to keep? Who decides and who pays the price? Joining us now on Breaking Views, Dr. Jyoti Bose, the director of the Spring Day School from the Pusa Road School to Dolakwa to Jaipur and Dubai. We have Professor Geeta Bhatt, academician and political analyst who supports the BJP. We have J.S. Rajput, former director of the NCERT, India's representative to the executive board of the UNESCO, and Zainab Sikandar will be joining us, a columnist. And we have, of course, Mr. Pavan Verma also joining us, the author and the national vice president of the All India Trinamool Congress. So let's start first. We have Mr. Rajput, we have two excerpts from poems written by renowned poet Faiz Ahmad Faiz Junk. The impact of globalization on agriculture, axed. A chapter on the Cold War era, the non-aligned movement, chapters on democracy and diversity, all of them junked. What are Indian students studying anymore anyway?
The first point that I would like to mention is, you have to have some institutions in the country in which you must put your trust. The nation must trust its institutions, its academics, and these changes are not made by one person or by an administrator. They are made through a process, and this process has been going on. It is necessary to make changes because of the last 2 years there was so much of emphasis on reducing curriculum load, and therefore rationalization was necessary. Now the experts who have made these changes must have examined whether these issues are being covered at some other stage or in some other chapters. I am sure they are conscious of it and they would definitely not have done this. When you
Some
reduce
must have
curriculum,
examined, you say
naturally
that
you will
one
have to
must have
drop
trust
certain
in
things now.
institutions. Isn't that the point of an education, to question? And if there is to be so much trust, when you say must have examined, why isn't this put out clearly in the public arena about how this process has come about?
No, there are so many members in the particular group that has done this part. I'm sure they must have discussed in great detail. They must have got suggestions from. Now think NCERT. You have to trust NCERT. You have to trust the CBSE. They have been making changes. In 2004, when the new government came, they junked everything that was done earlier and made such hurried changes. These books which we are still studying were prepared in a hurry. They were in fact a demolition job of all that has been done earlier, and there were a lot of things that has to be changed. Some of them had to be changed before 2014. And now you must also realize there are new poems that are coming up, there are new excavations in history, there are new inputs that are coming in history, there are new studies and researches, and therefore whenever it comes, wherever there is a name of Islam, suddenly the media becomes very active. And they start making all types of allegations and accusations. This is not the way that you treat your education in the country. You have a CBSE, you have an NCERT, you have experts. Why should a couple of people who had the hegemony over all these changes for a couple of decades?
So surely education should not be spoken of in these terms, in terms of hegemony within two political parties. This is the education. We're talking about the future of the children of India. We're not talking about who has an hegemony over the country and whether we should be studying what the ideology is of whichever government is in power at the point of time. That is the unfortunate truth, and that is what we're seeing here. The children of India are just buffeted depending on which government is in power. Jyoti Bose, your reaction, please, as a principal of many years. Let me bring in a principal here, Mr. Rajput. Let me bring in a principal here. What would you also say to the reaction we're getting from the NCERT and the CBSE that there's just too much of a burden on the children of India? Mr. Rajput, please let Ma'am Bose speak. We'll come back to you. It's a half-an-hour show.
I heard Professor Rajput, and I've known him for many years. I also know that the NCERT was mainly the curriculum framing body, and the CBSE was an examination board. Over the last few years, they seem to have merged in some sense. Professor Rajput says, yes, there has to be a rationalization. But I would like to put these larger questions, Sarah, before I get to the specifics. Let's look at this question. For example, let us look at, is regionalism now really opposed to nationalism? Let's look at, do democratic compulsions hinder development imperatives? The PM said recently, in July last year, that globalization has to be human-centric and it enhances the multilateral nation system. Yet, a few years ago, we were asked to staple a chapter, staple the chapter on partition. 2 years ago, it was asked to be modified, but it is not modified. So our young have been taken away from the partition. Let's look at the Cold War. Let's look at it in the light of Ukraine today. Non-aligned movement, as you said, the Chronicles, Industrial Revolution is gone, Islamic, Afro-Asian. Okay. Impact of globalization on agriculture. That's very interesting because food security, and yet we have the Prime Minister's Kisan Yojana, or whatever it is. Also, we have machinery from Israel to help us in agriculture. So, Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee was a great fan of Faiz Ahmad Faiz and had a larger picture, I think, in question. The question of democracy and diversity, I think, our Prime Minister travels all over the world in different, he's a wonderful at diplomacy and talks about globalization. He boasts of the largest democracy in the world. One of the largest. Our question of diverse India, he also wears Rajasthani turbans, he wears Assamese, he wears all. So let us look at him as a very much a futurist, a modern sort of person. But at the same time, harping on about Indian culture. The question is what we include in that. And therefore, I say that if we ask the Prime Minister that yes, democratic compulsions, do they hinder them? He will say no. Is regionalism opposed to nationalism? He'll say no. He will also say, that, it's not necessary perhaps to study partition. And yet, we are going back, as you have rightly named this program, that we are going back in history many ways by deleting the very chapters. So to me, it seems like a total contradiction of what Mr. Modi in fact is bringing to the world.
Correct.
And actually telling the world about India.
All right.
And what is actually happening on ground. Yeah.
Mr. Pawan Verma, the changes to the CBSE syllabus point to a pattern that's now familiar. You have Islamic history of India particularly targeted, but you also dropped this time round chapters on democracy and diversity, chapters that introduce students to the concept of social divisions, of inequality, race, caste, not just in India, but also around the world. Is this worrying to you?
Well, I believe that we need changes to the educational curriculum. I say this transcending political preferences because we have still not come out from the legacy of colonialism, and therefore great deals need to be restructured in the manner in which we teach our own history and tradition, our heritage and legacy. And there are still many aspects of our cultural and intellectual genius which have not been adequately highlighted, or some other parts have been disproportionately highlighted. So I believe the educational curriculum definitely needs an overlook beyond short-term partisan political prejudices. Now, and in the case of the current changes, in particular, let me ask about Faiz. What could be the reasons why you exclude Faiz from an educational book in India? Was he a mediocre poet? Was he hostile to India? Was he an Islamic fanatic? Is he a poet of global standards who, as we all know, was a revolutionary against military dictatorships and for greater friendship between India and Pakistan and fighting for the rights of the poor and the dispossessed? But when you begin to react like on reflex, then it seems to me, Saira, that it is a reflection of a culturally illiterate, narrow-minded and intellectually stunted approach. And I'll give you an example for that. And I'll tell you what is being reflected in the selectivity that is being shown today. We had a leading member of parliament from the ruling party, the BJP, who carried out a nationwide movement against an ad campaign where words of Urdu were used in the celebration of Diwali.
True.
Have we become a banana? Have we become bonkers completely? Anyone who says Diwali Mubarak is now suspect. If you say Happy Christmas, you are suspect. Who is deciding on whether the language that belongs to India, Urdu belongs to India. Pakistan also speaks it. And Faiz belongs to the cumulative cultural, intellectual and historical legacy of this part of the region and beyond. So why would you delete Faiz, I ask you? And is it only because it's in Pakistan? We have legitimate problems with Pakistan. They need to be solved politically, diplomatically, and where necessary by the use of our defense forces. But now, because you are against Pakistan, should we say that we will not teach Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, which happen to be in Pakistan? Should we ignore the great university Takshila, which is now in Pakistan? So there has to be a balance. In a country where you carry out a campaign against an ad campaign for using an Urdu word which we use every day in our lives. Do you think that those who are arbiters of the educational curriculum will not use it? And as far as you remember, please understand that these deletions have been made on a chapter on religion and communalism.
Yes.
That is a point that needs to be noted, because I believe this government can be charged with being implicit and complicit in the increasing communal polarization of India to the detriment of the overall good of the nation. And so we have to ask, here is a great poet. He writes in Urdu and, by the way, in Punjabi, which is also our language.
Yes.
And should Indian students be now put in insular silos,
Yes.
according to the diktat and whim of those who see history
Yes.
from a narrow tunnel of only what they decide is truly Indian and good for our students? What is happening to the nuanced, sophisticated, highly complex grandeur of Indian civilization through this kind of lens? Democracy and diversity. Democracy is about preserving diversity. It is not a monolith. It is not about the imposition of one party's values on the remarkable richness and diversity of India. And so I say, while accepting that educational curriculums have been subject to the partisan ideologies of transient political parties when they are in power, I say today education needs to be rescued
Yes.
from this narrow mindset. And we need to have a debate. Young children, do you need to ask, do you know how popular Faiz is? Please go to India Gate when the Rekhta annual festival of letters take place, which is largely about Urdu poetry. I have written a book on Ghalib. I have written a book on Adi Shankaracharya. There is no need to be caught in the binaries of a political divide on the basis of shallowness of knowledge. There are thousands and thousands of youngsters who crowd that festival which celebrates Urdu. And they want to know about the best Urdu writers, of which Faiz was undoubtedly one. And a revolutionary says, "Hum dekhenge. Lazim hai ki hum bhi dekhenge." Against military dictatorship. Which young couple, which young student in India is not familiar with his nazm? Mujhse pehli si mohabbat mere mehboob nama. So I say to you, and then he says, "Bol ke lab azad hai tere." He spoke of freedom, he spoke of democracy, he spoke of development, he spoke of a new vision, of a new global order. And I say, accommodate Faiz, don't delete. And please set your house in order by including so much else that needs to be revived in our educational curriculum. We don't have space for the kind of colonial straitjacket we have not yet emerged from. The problem is the government is not doing what it requires to do sincerely and without prejudice.
Instead of fixing a problem,
using prejudice to eliminate what good exists already.
instead of fixing a problem, making it
And this is
worse.
a serious challenge to the sophisticated culture which is India's.
Geeta Bhatt, are we going to restrict ourselves to only reading or studying about people who align with the ruling party's ideology or our nationality? Faiz was an internationalist.
Well, sir, I hope I'll get some time to speak. I want to put forth 2 points. One, I'll come to Faiz also. First point is that, you see, Pavanji mentioned that, yes, we need to include as many as possible. Yes, it's a very welcome idea, but you see, there are limitations in terms of how much time in classrooms can be given to a particular subject. It is not just, one particular subject that students study. They have to at least study 6 to 7 subjects, and each one of them have to be given equal importance. And the most difficult part in making, for any person who's making a syllabus or is in a committee to make a syllabus, is what to exclude, because every part of it has got some relevance. So including is very easy, but excluding is very difficult. Now we need to have faith in the wisdom of the committees who have given these recommendations, because it is not just one person who decides what is to be added and what is to be removed. There are various committees which work on it, and then the decision is taken. Now, second point is that no one is questioning the intellect of Faiz. Who is questioning the intellect of Faiz? Yes, he has written some very wonderful poems. He was a Pakistani poet who was on the rolls of the British Army for quite some time, and then later on he became the editor of the Pakistan Times. And when Muhammad Ali Jinnah died, at that time, when the editorial piece that he wrote, he wrote praises about Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and also wrote at the same time. Please give me. No, it is important. See, you can't selectively look at things.
Is that why he's been dropped?
No,
I'm
it is
not
not.
sure what you're saying is right.
No, Sarah, you need to give me. See, listen. I
need to give you time, but I cannot allow you to make falsehoods on
It is not falsehoods. It is not falsehoods. Excuse me. It is not falsehoods. First of all,
when was he on the
check
British rolls?
Right. He was working as an
Geeta, but this is the problem when you remove this from our education and we can't even read what the truth is anymore. Is that the intention here?
Have you read about... Now, see, you are not allowing me to speak. You can contest me if I am wrong, and I will personally also send you documentation which shows that he had worked for the British Army also. But the point here is that he was a Pakistani poet and good enough.
Born in India in 1911.
Excuse me, can I just
became Pakistani in 1947.
He became Pakistani, and he also wrote that he is worried about the future of Indian Muslims who worked as hard as those who settled in Pakistan for making of the Pakistan.
He
anyway,
fought
it is
in
not
the
related
Indian
to
Army
this.
in the Second World War. I am not sure where you are learning that he was on the rolls of the British.
Faiz needs to be part of undergraduate and university curriculums.
Is that why he has been dropped, Geeta Bhatt? Because he is Pakistani. Does that mean we're not going to study about Martin Luther King's writings? Does that mean we're not going to study about Gabriel Garcia Marquez?
Why can't we include Ramdhari Singh Dinkar? Why
Alright, so now we're getting to the point.
Why is it not important that Indian poets, Indian students must first know their Indian poets? And we can
include Faiz because of
Indian poets. Pavanji, with all respect, I did not speak in between you. Please allow me to complete. Please allow me to complete. My point is that in universities, while we can have Faiz where we can include him in linguistics, in poetry, in literature, there could be comparatives between how the poets, in our neighboring countries, how they wrote, pieces where they express their struggle against autocratic rules. Yes, definitely. Why can't we have? But why this fixation that Faiz has to be there? A Pakistani poet has to be there in the class 10 syllabus. My contention is this. He can be read,
not
we can
because
have separate chapters.
He can't be dropped because he's Pakistani. Alright, let's move on. Let's get in Zainab Sikandar also over here. But Geeta, I want to clarify one thing. This he faced a ban on his poetry in Pakistan, and when Zia-ul Haq's regime, they considered him anti-national. So I'm not going to allow you to say on this channel falsehoods and fake truth.
He has to be put in class 10 syllabus. Just because he struggled, he had a struggling life in Pakistan.
He wrote about the despotic regime of Zia-ul Haq.
Yes,
and perhaps many would say we are hurtling towards becoming another Pakistan if we delete Faiz from our own syllabus. All right, Zainab Sikandar, please could you let's come in over here. Your reactions to these cuts. Geeta Bhatt claims it's not easy to drop, something needs to be dropped, but is there a pattern that we see here that basically it's, Islamic studies that is targeted?
Yes, of course, it's very clear. But I'd like to say, she was saying it's very tough to exclude things and very easy to include things. The problem in India today is inclusivity. It's become a huge problem. I don't think inclusivity is so easy in India today. And as a Muslim, I think twice before speaking on a poet who's from Pakistan, because, attributing me to be a Pakistan sympathizer is so easy. So, I always think twice before talking. But are we really contesting a man who's written some of the most beautiful poetry just because he's Pakistani? Are we supposed to look at art only based on which country a person has come from? I think that is really petty-mindedness. If we look at art, we stopped cricket matches with Pakistan, then we went on to stop artists from coming and performing. But art is beyond ethnicity, race, religion, even language. If I will tell a child not to read a Faiz poetry just because he happens to be from Pakistan, then they say art is like fragrance. You can try and put as many curtains over flowers as you want, but the fragrance remains. Now, if, Faiz's poetry, for example, or even something like diversity and democracy, these concepts,
I think these
which
two
are
excerpts of
very
Faiz, we're
integral.
speaking for a larger pattern where we're doing a huge disservice to the children of India and to India as a whole. And let's not forget, many schools, most schools where our children go to are all moving to the IB. Nobody wants to study the CBSE and the syllabus anymore.
Absolutely.
And the rich and the well-off and all the politicians right now in power, their children are all studying in these IB schools. Their children are all studying abroad. And the CBSE syllabus is being played around with, and the future of the children of India is being played around with. And I can say maybe by this government and previous governments, but it hasn't ended and it needs to end. Thank you all for your time. Thank you for joining us tonight on Breaking News.